He successfully changed the way the world viewed fast food. However, it came at a cost. And this cost wasn't just physical, it was personal, painful, and ultimately tragic. Morgan Spurlock shocked the world when he turned his body into a battleground against Big Macs and marketing. But nothing could have prepared him for the damage that followed him for the rest of his life. And after the applause faded, he began facing deeply personal battles and controversies that shattered his reputation. What really happened to Morgan Spurlock, and why were the final years of his life so heartbreaking? The man who took on McDonald's. Morgan Spurlock, the man who would change the way the world viewed fast food, was born in 1970 to a disciplined family that shaped his moral convictions and gave him an eye for questioning systems. As a student, Spurlock studied film at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, graduating in 1993. In the years that followed, he carved out a modest but creative career on the fringes of mainstream entertainment. He was neither a major television star nor a household name, but his work was consistent. One of his early projects was the MTV web series I Bet You Will, a brash, oddball show that paid ordinary people to perform outrageous stunts like eating gross food combinations, getting strange tattoos, or acting funny in public. The show was part shock value, part sociological experiment, and while it didn't catapult Spurlock into the limelight, it did showcase something central to his creative mind, and that was his willingness to explore the boundaries of culture and behavior, especially when money, food, and spectacle were involved. But it was in 2003, during a quiet moment after Thanksgiving, that Spurlock saw something that changed the direction of his career. He reportedly saw a news report that 2 teenage girls had sued McDonald's, blaming the company for their obesity. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed for lack of evidence, but it triggered something in Spurlock. If fast food really was contributing to rising rates of obesity and chronic illness, how could that be proven in a way the public could grasp? He didn't want to write an article or publish a think piece. He wanted something more practical, and he came up with the idea of using his own body as the experiment. So, in February 2003, Morgan Spurlock began what would become one of the most infamous self-imposed health experiments ever captured on film. For 30 consecutive days, he would eat only McDonald's food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No outside snacks, no homemade meals, and no exceptions. If a McDonald's employee offered to supersize his meal, he had to accept. The only physical activity allowed was walking no more than 1.5 miles per day, the average distance an American walks in daily life. The idea was simple: live like a sedentary consumer of fast food and document the results. The effects came quickly and alarmingly. Within 5 days, Spurlock had gained nearly 10 pounds, and by the end of the month, he had gained 25 pounds total. A dramatic change that shocked not just the viewers of his film, but his own doctors. But weight gain was just the beginning. Spurlock began experiencing mood swings, lethargy, and, most disturbingly, signs of fatty liver disease. His physician warned him during the filming that he was putting his life in danger. The changes to his liver function were described as toxic, and he was urged to stop the experiment early. However, he refused. The documentary, titled Super Size Me, premiered at the 2004 Sundance Film Festival and took the film world by storm. Audiences weren't just shocked by the health consequences Spurlock faced. They were disturbed by what it revealed about the fast food industry's role in shaping public health. The film was not subtle. It was an indictment not just of McDonald's, but of the entire culture surrounding convenience food, marketing to children, and corporate disregard for consumer well-being. Despite being produced on a budget of just $65,000, Super Size Me went on to gross more than $22 million worldwide, becoming one of the most financially successful documentaries of its time. It was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the Academy Awards, and although it didn't win, the nomination alone was enough to cement its status as a major cultural moment. Just weeks after the film's release, McDonald's announced it was phasing out the supersize option in its restaurants. The company denied that the decision was related to the film, stating instead that it was part of a broader effort to simplify its menu. But the timing raised eyebrows. The public wasn't convinced. Many believed Spurlock's film had forced the company to take a hard look at how its food and marketing practices were perceived, even if the corporation wouldn't admit it openly. More importantly, the documentary touched a nerve globally. It was translated into multiple languages and screened in classrooms, universities, and health seminars around the world. Conversations about nutrition, portion sizes, school lunches, and food regulation were suddenly in the spotlight. Governments and advocacy groups began demanding better food labeling and transparency from fast food companies. In that sense, Spurlock's 30-day gamble wasn't just a stunt. It had become a global wake-up call. At the time, many viewed him as a hero, and every man willing to risk his health to make a point about the food millions of people consume daily without thinking. His casual manner, slightly sarcastic narration, and unapologetic approach made the film feel accessible, even when the subject matter was grim. He didn't act like an elite or a crusader. He was just a guy who wanted answers and was willing to put himself through a painful process to get them. In an interview, while speaking about his reasons for making the film, he said, "It was important to me not to make a preachy film that tells you how to live your life, but presents you with a picture that gives you enough information so that you'd go home and think about what you've seen." People are not walking out saying, "I'm getting a lawyer and I'm suing McDonald's tomorrow, thank goodness," because that's not what the movie is about. But behind the viral success and headlines, the experiment had long-term consequences, not just on Spurlock's health, but on how he would be perceived in the years that followed. Critics began to dig into the details of his methodology. Was the weight gain truly caused only by the food? Was his level of physical activity accurate? Some dietitians and food scientists argued that his diet could have been balanced more carefully, even using McDonald's menu options. The backlash didn't erase the film's impact, but it did open a second wave of debate, this time about the role of documentary filmmaking in shaping public perception. Still, it was hard to argue with the visual and emotional impact the film had. Audiences watched as his body and mood spiraled over 30 days, and this left a mark on viewers, no matter what side of the debate they stood on. And while the film became super popular, Morgan Spurlock, the man behind it, was facing battles of a very different kind. Fame had found him and opened doors for him, but it had also invited controversy, industry pushback, and eventually personal demons that would threaten to overshadow everything he had built. And what Morgan Spurlock faced after Super Size Me would test him in ways no experiment ever could. The battles behind the camera. Morgan Spurlock became famous for putting his body on the line in front of a camera. But long before Super Size Me made headlines around the world, he had been quietly fighting a battle behind the scenes that was far more destructive and deeply personal than a month of fast food. While millions were watching him take on McDonald's, what they didn't see was that Spurlock had been struggling with alcohol addiction for most of his life. Years later, in a raw and unexpected confession, he admitted something few people saw coming. Spurlock revealed that he had been drinking regularly since he was 13 years old, not casually or even socially, but steadily and often heavily. In his own words, he claimed he hadn't been sober for more than a week in over 30 years. This revelation reshaped how many people looked back at the famous 30-day McDonald's experiment. It cast a long shadow over the film's most shocking results, particularly the severe liver damage that he experienced. When Super Size Me first premiered, viewers and critics attributed the deterioration of his health solely to fast food. But with hindsight, medical professionals and skeptics began to ask a hard question. If Spurlock had been drinking throughout adulthood, could alcohol have been the real, or at least partial, culprit? Medical experts have since weighed in, suggesting that some of the more extreme changes Spurlock experienced, especially in his liver, might have been exacerbated or even primarily caused by alcohol abuse. This doesn't erase the impact of eating nothing but fast food for 30 days, but it does add complexity to the narrative. Even during the actual filming of Super Size Me, Spurlock later revealed he had been depressed, but his mood swings weren't just caused by sugar crashes or saturated fats. He had struggled with mental health issues for years, something he kept carefully hidden behind his easy humor and engaging on-screen presence. Off-camera, he was a man unraveling in slow motion. The Spurlock that audiences came to know was charismatic, confident, and sharp. He was the documentary narrator with a clever turn of phrase and a fearless attitude. But privately, he was dealing with something far darker. His battle with depression, combined with long-term substance use, created a personal storm that followed him into every project and relationship. By the time Super Size Me had turned him into a household name, Spurlock was also struggling in his personal life. He was known for being moody and self-critical. Infidelity became a recurring issue in his romantic relationships, and he later admitted to cheating on partners in moments of guilt, shame, and emotional instability. The same intense personality that drove him to test the limits of his own health for a documentary also drove unpredictable behavior in private. He also confessed to often feeling undeserving of love and success, and this feeling deeply impacted some of his worst decisions. The contradiction between his public persona and his private pain only grew more complex as his fame increased. On stage or in interviews, Spurlock was energetic, quick-witted, and passionate about issues ranging from food politics to corporate ethics. But once the lights dimmed, he faced a loneliness and anxiety that fame couldn't fix. His life was full of recognition, but lacking in real peace. He could make a room laugh, but he couldn't quiet the noise in his own mind. And yet, for years, these struggles remained hidden from the public. Spurlock worked tirelessly, releasing more documentaries and building a reputation as a fearless storyteller. He tackled topics from the United States education system to product placement, always with a critical eye and a flair for satire. But behind that professional drive was a man whose internal battles were beginning to crack through the surface. It wasn't just addiction or depression. It was a deep, unresolved sense of self-doubt that followed him everywhere. For someone who had become famous by holding corporations accountable, he was less prepared to hold himself accountable, at least not publicly. He later admitted that even as he was pointing fingers at fast food companies, he was avoiding the mirror. And while Super Size Me was praised for sparking global conversations, a quiet conversation about Spurlock's own health, habits, and self-destructive patterns had been delayed until they could no longer be ignored. As time went on, his relationships continued to suffer. The people closest to him often bore the brunt of his mood swings. While he maintained a professional image and kept producing work, those around him saw the cracks forming. By the time he publicly admitted his struggles, those who knew him best were not surprised. It felt like they had been watching a slow-motion implosion long before the world caught on. But Morgan Spurlock was never just an activist filmmaker. He was someone trying, in his own way, to make sense of a chaotic world, while quietly struggling to survive his own chaos. He made his pain productive. He turned it into documentaries, into headlines, and into change. But the weight of holding up a public image while privately falling apart became too much to carry, and eventually, the truth would come out about everything he had hidden for years. What began as a bold social experiment had grown into a global movement. But for Spurlock himself, the cost was personal, and it wasn't long before his story took an even darker turn that he never quite recovered from. The fall of Morgan Spurlock. By the end of the 2010s, Morgan Spurlock had built a brand as a bold advocate, truth seeker, and someone unafraid to shine a spotlight on uncomfortable subjects. But in December 2017, he did something no one expected. In the middle of a rapidly growing global movement calling out misconduct in Hollywood and beyond, Spurlock didn't wait to be accused. He came forward with an extremely shocking confession on his own. In a candid, emotionally charged essay posted online, Spurlock confessed to a long list of personal and professional failings. He described himself plainly, "I am part of the problem." The timing was deliberate, as this was during the peak of the #MeToo movement, when powerful men across industries were being exposed for inappropriate conduct. But while others were being named by others, Spurlock made the bold decision to name himself. He said, "I don't sit by and wonder who will be next. I wonder, when will they come for me?" He detailed a troubling pattern of behavior. In the essay, he admitted to calling a female assistant an inappropriate nickname, which had led to a settlement for misconduct. He wrote about his pattern of infidelity in every one of his relationships and his habit of emotionally sabotaging those close to him. He described moments where his actions crossed lines, where he was careless with power, and where he failed to fully understand the harm he'd caused. His words were, "I hurt them, and I hate it, but it didn't make me stop. The worst part is, I'm someone who consistently hurts those closest to me. From my wife to my friends, to my family, to my partners and co-workers. I have helped create a world of disrespect through my own actions." Spurlock didn't deny, downplay, or deflect. He admitted that he had been unfaithful to every wife and girlfriend he ever had. His confession went viral instantly. Media outlets around the world picked it up. Some called it brave, while others called it calculated. Many questioned his motives. Was he being honest, or was this a preemptive move to protect himself from potential exposure? Whatever the intent, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Spurlock stepped down from Warrior Poets, the production company he had founded and built from the ground up. For years, Warrior Poets had been his creative engine that produced documentaries, TV shows, and branded content that bore his unique voice. Walking away from it wasn't just a professional decision, it was the dismantling of his identity. Then came the blow that changed the trajectory of his career permanently. Super Size Me 2, Holy Chicken, was supposed to be his comeback film, a sequel that explored how fast food chains were now rebranding themselves as healthy, organic, or humane, while still engaging in questionable practices. It had already premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and was set for a high-profile release on YouTube Red, which had invested in the project. But after his confession, YouTube pulled the film. The platform dropped its distribution deal almost immediately, without comment. Suddenly, the sequel to his career-defining film had no home. To make matters worse, other distribution options fell apart, and projects that had been in the pipeline were shelved. Investors filed lawsuits, claiming that Spurlock had damaged their financial interests by not disclosing the potential reputational risks. The man who had once profited from transparency was now watching it unravel his career. Industry allies grew silent. Collaborators distanced themselves. What Spurlock might have hoped would be a step toward redemption quickly turned into a public collapse. His decision to self-disclose didn't earn him lasting praise, it earned him public suspicion and professional exile. Critics raised an uncomfortable point. While Spurlock had admitted to wrongdoing, he had also controlled the timing and the narrative. He chose his words. He chose his moment. Some accused him of trying to get ahead of future accusations, not out of accountability, but out of self-preservation, while others pointed out that the tone of his letter, which was reflective and self-aware, came off as performative. Whatever the motive, the damage was done, and the fallout wasn't limited to one or two projects. His credibility as a filmmaker and as someone who could challenge corporate systems or expose uncomfortable truths was now deeply compromised. The public had once embraced Spurlock as a watchdog, a provocateur with a purpose. But now, he was being held to the same level of scrutiny he had once directed at others. For someone whose entire body of work relied on authenticity, trust, and moral high ground, the personal admission proved to be a breaking point. Not because he was flawed, but because the flaws were in direct conflict with the image he had built and the values he had championed. He had asked audiences to question food companies, media manipulation, and consumer culture, but he hadn't yet fully questioned himself, at least not in public. The idea of Morgan Spurlock as a cultural truth-teller could no longer hold. Viewers who once saw him as a relatable everyman now had questions about the ethics behind the camera, the stories he chose to tell, and the things he chose to leave out. The confession, though honest in tone, came too late to salvage the trust that had already begun to erode. And so, the fall wasn't just professional, it was personal, cultural, and reputational. A man once celebrated for risking his health to reveal the dangers of fast food had now revealed something even more uncomfortable: the limits of his own accountability. The spotlight he had used so effectively in his career was now turned squarely on him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Meanwhile, Super Size Me 2 Holy Chicken eventually found release through a smaller distributor and premiered in 2019. But without the fanfare it had once been promised. It received decent reviews. Many noted its sharp insights and humor. But the public conversation wasn't about the film. It was still about the filmmaker. And by then, the damage was too deep. Spurlock's fall was not as loud as some others in the public sphere. However, in many ways, it had an extremely devastating impact that he never recovered from. He had confessed, but his confession did not lead to forgiveness. It led to isolation. And so, in the final years of his life, Spurlock disappeared from the headlines. But what happened in the silence that followed would reveal even more about the man behind the camera. The heartbreaking final chapter. After his public confession in 2017, Morgan Spurlock quietly stepped away from the spotlight. For a man once so visible, so central to conversations about health, food, and media, the silence in his later years was striking. He gave no major interviews, appeared at no festivals, and no longer stood behind the camera offering commentary. The energy that once drove him to challenge global corporations had faded, and in its place was something quieter and far more personal. Spurlock's disappearance wasn't just a retreat from fame. It reflected a deeper struggle that had started long before Super Size Me made him a household name. In private, he continued to battle the very issues he had laid bare in his confession, from addiction to shame and a deteriorating sense of self. He had spent decades documenting the failings of society, but his own personal reckoning remained unfinished. Though he never fully returned to public life, those close to him say he remained a creator at heart. He continued to write, to develop ideas, and to think about the world's broken systems. However, he was no longer the center of public discourse, and in many ways, that seemed intentional. The man who had once gone viral for eating fast food was now focused on survival, reflection, and staying out of the headlines. But time did not bring healing. Over the years, Spurlock's health began to decline. While much of the world had moved on from his controversies, those around him noticed the toll the past had taken. His lifelong battle with alcohol addiction and depression left both physical and emotional scars. The once energetic filmmaker was, by his early 50s, fighting a different kind of enemy that was extremely relentless. In May 2024, Morgan Spurlock passed away at the age of 53 from complications related to cancer. The announcement stunned many. For some, it was the first time they had thought about him in years. For others, it was a tragic full stop at the end of a deeply complicated sentence. His family released a short but heartfelt statement that read, "Morgan gave so much through his art, ideas, and generosity. Today, the world has lost a true creative genius and a special man." It was a simple message, but it hinted at the contradictions he embodied during his life. Spurlock was a man that was both celebrated and criticized. He was bold and broken, as well as brilliant and flawed. Spurlock's death reignited a conversation that had never quite disappeared. Can we separate the art from the artist? It's a question that has haunted cultural commentary for decades. And in Spurlock's case, the answer remains complicated. On one hand, his work, especially Super Size Me, continues to be shown in classrooms, cited in academic research, and credited with changing the way people think about food, marketing, and personal responsibility. On the other hand, his personal confessions and the fallout that followed have reshaped how some people view that same work. Was it still a wake-up call? Absolutely. But was it the full truth? That's a harder question to answer. There's no denying that Super Size Me left an indelible mark. It didn't just entertain, it sparked a global dialogue. The film prompted restaurants to reevaluate their menus, led to policy conversations about childhood obesity, and inspired a wave of young filmmakers to use storytelling as a form of activism. In that sense, Morgan Spurlock did what few documentarians ever managed to do when he changed public behavior. He proved that a camera, in the right hands, could be a weapon against corporate apathy. But as the years passed, the gap between Spurlock's public message and his private life grew wider. His legacy now sits in limbo, somewhere between cultural icon and cautionary tale. He was a man who held up a mirror to society but struggled to face his own reflection. And while that doesn't erase his accomplishments, it does complicate how we remember them. His story is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a story of moral complexity, of a man who fought for truth in the public arena while battling deception in his private life. He exposed corporate greed, manipulative marketing, and unhealthy systems, but he could not escape his own self-destructive patterns. The same drive that pushed him to take risks and tell hard truths also led him into personal choices that caused pain, for himself and for others. In many ways, Morgan Spurlock's life is a reminder that fame is not a cure, that accountability must go deeper than headlines, and that being a messenger of truth does not exempt someone from facing their own. He tried to own his mistakes. He tried to speak openly about the darkness he carried. And in doing so, he opened a new kind of conversation about what it means to confront your past, not just in public, but within yourself. His death, though tragic, ultimately brings some peace to a story marked by tension and contradiction. For fans of his work, it's a time to remember the boldness of his vision. For critics, it's a chance to reflect on the dangers of unchecked influence. And for everyone in between, it's a moment to sit with the uncomfortable truth that people, like the systems they critique, are rarely simple. Morgan Spurlock was not perfect. He was not evil. He was not a hero or a villain in the black and white sense. He was a deeply human figure who used his art to challenge the world, and who, in the process, revealed the very flaws that make that challenge so difficult. He left behind films that will outlive him, messages that still echo, and a life story that will serve as both inspiration and warning for years to come. What do you think? Did Morgan Spurlock deserve the way he was treated in his final years? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.